Okay, so picture this, right? It's July 1955. You're in Mexicali. It's got to be like 100 degrees, easy, super brutal, and you're surrounded by thousands of people.
Yeah.
All just reported from the U.S.
Wow.
No warning, just dumped there. This wasn't some random thing. This was Operation Wetback.
Right.
And that's what we're diving into today, the largest mass deportation in American history.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak chapter.
We've got news articles from the time, historical accounts, even some declassified government documents. We're talking potentially 1.3 million people deported.
Although some historians actually put that number closer to 300,000.
Right. There's debate there. But either way, it was massive. And to really understand it, we've got to go back before the immigration reforms of 1965.
Yeah, before 65, the U.S. had a very different system. It was called the National Origins Formula.
Okay, so what was that all about?
Basically, it was designed to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and it really clamped down on Mexican immigration, too.
So even before Operation Wetback, there were already roadblocks in place for Mexican immigrants.
Oh, absolutely. It was built into the system.
I mean, no wonder there was such a focus on Mexican immigrants during this whole era.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the policy. It was the whole atmosphere. There's a lot of anti-Mexican sentiment in the U.S. back then.
Not just like quiet prejudice either. We're talking stereotypes all over the media,
Yeah.
jobs that flat out wouldn't hire Mexicans, even housing segregation.
It was pretty widespread, yeah. And it created a climate where a program like Operation Wetback could actually gain support.
And that brings us to the operation itself. One thing that surprised me, going into this was that it wasn't just about rounding up people who crossed the border illegally.
Oh, right. A lot of people don't realize that.
A lot of Mexicans had come in legally through programs like the Bracero Program, but they got targeted too.
That's a key point. Operation Wetback wasn't about, the legality of how someone arrived. It was about removing all undocumented Mexicans.
So it was like this blanket operation, just massive in its scope. And when you look at the methods they used, it's kind of mind-blowing. We're talking like military-style tactics.
Yeah, it was a pretty intense operation.
Raids, checkpoints, helicopters, boats patrolling the Rio Grande. I mean, it was like a full-scale invasion almost.
It was more than just rounding folks up, too. The way they treated those who were deported, it was awful.
The stories are really hard to read. Families torn apart, people dying from heat and exhaustion during deportation. It's just heartbreaking.
And crammed onto buses, trains in that heat. Sometimes even flown to parts of Mexico they'd never even been to before.
Yeah.
It was a dark period.
It reminds me of what happened during the Great Depression. Wasn't there something similar then?
You're thinking of the Mexican repatriation, yeah. During the 1930s, up to 1.8 million people of Mexican descent were deported.
Wow.
And many of them, they were actually U.S. citizens.
Seriously?
It was another time of intense economic anxiety. And Mexicans were scapegoated, much like during Operation Wetback, actually.
So we have this pattern of mass deportations. Then World War II hits, and the U.S. suddenly needs workers. And that's where the Bracero Program comes in. It was supposed to be a solution, right?
Yeah, the Bracero Program started in 1942. The idea was to bring Mexican laborers to the U.S. legally, primarily for agriculture.
Makes sense. They needed people to work the fields.
Right. It was a direct response to wartime labor shortages. And in theory, it was supposed to provide protections, fair wages, decent housing, that kind of thing.
But I'm guessing the reality was a bit different.
It often was, yeah. But alongside this official program, you still had a huge influx of undocumented workers, especially in Texas.
Right. And isn't that where the term wetback comes from?
It is, unfortunately. And it's a term rooted in prejudice, referring to those crossing the Rio Grande.
Yeah, it's a pretty dehumanizing term.
It really reflects the attitudes of the time. And it's important to note that Texas was actually excluded from the Bracero Program at first.
Oh, why was that?
Because of their history of exploiting workers. Texas farmers relied heavily on undocumented labor. They could avoid the regulations and costs of the Bracero Program that way.
So the federal government eventually felt like they had to step in, huh?
Exactly. They saw it as a challenge to their authority, that they wanted control over the labor flow. And that desire for control, combined with all the anti-Mexican sentiment, well, it created the perfect conditions for Operation Wetback.
And that's where a figure like Harlan B. Carter enters the picture. He was head of the Border Patrol at the time, right? Went on to lead the NRA, too.
Yeah, pretty controversial figure. Even had a murder conviction as a teenager, actually.
Wow, okay. So what was his role in all this?
Carter was all about strict immigration enforcement. He saw the influx of Mexicans, both documented and undocumented, as a threat. His views really aligned with those in power who wanted to, control the labor market and appease those anti-immigrant fears.
So Carter wasn't just passively enforcing the laws, right? This was a deliberate campaign.
Absolutely. Operation Wetback was planned like a military operation. They even used propaganda to play on public fear and build support.
It's crazy how they framed it as a matter of national security. Did they really believe undocumented workers were a threat?
Well, that narrative really tapped into the anxieties of the time. Anxieties that were often fueled by, economic uncertainty and racial prejudice.
So by making undocumented Mexican immigrants the enemy, they could justify these extreme measures.
Exactly. So while Operation Wetback was presented as being about controlling immigration, there were all these other factors at play: economic interests, political maneuvering, and of course, the manipulation of public perception through propaganda.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on people's lives.
Right. It wasn't just about numbers on a page. We're talking families separated, communities disrupted, basic human dignity violated.
It was a dark chapter for sure.
It's kind of wild how both Operation Wetback and that earlier one, the Mexican repatriation, used fear and prejudice to kick people out, even like American citizens.
Right. It's like, whoa, hold on. Basic human rights, anybody.
It makes you think, how easy it is to just toss those aside when people get scared.
Yeah. And what's even more disturbing is this idea that people of Mexican descent were just disposable.
Like they didn't matter.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking, it pops up throughout history, unfortunately. So how did this all play out, like on the ground? How did they actually do Operation Wetback?
Yeah, what were the tactics?
Well, it was, like we talked about before, very coordinated, military style,
Not just hanging out at the border, right?
Nope. They were raiding workplaces, farms, even going into people's homes. Helicopters for surveillance, checkpoints to control movement, the whole 9 yards. It was a huge show of force.
Sending a message.
Oh, yeah. Undocumented. We're coming for you. And they weren't shy about the propaganda either. Posters everywhere. Radio announcements.
Trying to make it seem like this heroic thing, right?
Exactly. Like, look at us, saving America. But behind all that, there were so many violations.
People's rights just ignored.
People detained without warrants, no lawyers, deported without, any real process. They were so focused on being efficient that they didn't care about treating people fairly.
Even the Bracero Program, which was supposed to be the legal way to work, wasn't perfect, was it?
No. It was supposed to be this humane alternative, but often it wasn't. Lots of reports of terrible housing, stolen wages, dangerous working conditions.
So you've got this mass deportation happening, a guest worker program with tons of problems, and this whole atmosphere of fear and prejudice.
Yeah.
What was the end result? Did they get what they wanted?
On paper, they called it a huge success. Look at all the people we deported, they said. We fixed the border. Jobs are safe. But the human cost, man. Families ripped apart, communities shattered. Mexican-American communities felt that fear and distrust for decades.
And long term, did it even work? Did it stop undocumented immigration?
Yeah.
Fix the labor shortage?
You hit the nail on the head. Probably not. They might have pushed some folks out for a while, but the reasons people were coming, those didn't go away.
In a way, you could argue that by relying on undocumented labor, they actually made the labor situation worse. It's like they shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah, instead of, building a system that was fair and stable. So what's the takeaway? Operation Wetback didn't solve anything. It just created a bunch of new problems, made things worse.
And it leaves us with these huge questions. How do we deal with this messed up part of our history? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again?
Those are the big questions, right? And it starts with thinking critically, not buying into those easy narratives that demonize whole groups of people.
Seeing everyone as a human being, regardless of their immigration status.
Exactly. And realizing that people migrate for complicated reasons. We can't let fear and prejudice drive our policies.
And the legacy of this, of Operation Wetback, it still affects how we talk about immigration today.
It does. And it's a reminder that we got to be careful. We can't just go for the quick fix that ignores compassion and fairness.
It's a tough conversation, but we have to have it, honestly and openly, facing those uncomfortable truths about our past.
Right, because that's how we learn from it and try to do better. And, when it's done right, immigration can be a really good thing for a country.
So far, we've looked at the history of Operation Wetback, all the tactics they use, the consequences, and the way it still shapes how the U.S. handles immigration.
We've talked about how horrible mass deportations are and the problems with using military force against civilians. And we've seen how it's all still part of the immigration debates happening right now. It's all about remembering to be kind, understanding where people are coming from, and finding solutions that are actually just and humane. But there's one last piece to all of this.
Yeah, you mentioned how Operation Wetback still affects immigration discussions even now. I'd love to dig into that more. Like, how did this one event from so long ago, almost 70 years, how did it change the legal stuff we're dealing with now?
Well, it wasn't just about the people directly affected, it set a precedent for how the U.S. handles immigration. Enforcement, I mean. Like, using military-style tactics. It became more normal after that, even though it's controversial.
So it blurred the lines
Yeah.
between like regular cops and the military.
Exactly. And that raises concerns about, abuse of power, especially around the border.
So we're still dealing with the ghost of Operation Wetback, basically, in our laws and even just how we think about things.
Yeah. It's like this echo. And it's important to remember that this didn't happen out of nowhere. It was the Cold War. Everyone was on edge about communism. National security was a huge deal.
So that context, that really helps explain how the government could pull off something this big.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about it. People were scared. So when the government said, hey, these undocumented immigrants, they're a threat, people were more likely to believe it.
Because of communism, yeah.
Right. And that connection between what's happening inside the U.S. and what's happening with other countries, it keeps coming up. Like the Japanese internment during World War II, the Red Scare in the 50s. Even now, with all the talk about immigration and terrorism.
It's like when things are uncertain, we tend to freak out and point fingers at certain groups.
Yeah, and it's easy to get caught up in those stories, those narratives that make a whole group of people seem like the bad guys. That's why we have to be careful, Look at events like Operation Wetback with a critical eye. Understand what was really going on.
And the impact on Mexican-American communities. That was huge. Not just being forced to leave, but the feeling of being targeted, like ostracized.
Right. It created this atmosphere of fear and mistrust that lasted for generations, made the prejudice worse, contributed to, Mexican Americans being treated like second-class citizens.
It probably even made people afraid to speak up, to fight for their rights.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Afraid to organize, to protest. It was a major setback.
It's sad, Those wounds from the past, they take so long to heal.
They really do. And it makes you wonder, how do we deal with that as a country? How do we even begin to fix the damage from something like Operation Wetback?
Yeah, how do we make sure it doesn't happen again?
It's a big question, and it starts with talking about it, being honest about what happened.
Even if it's uncomfortable. Yeah.
Exactly. And we got to understand that immigration, it's not just one thing. It's all these different stories, reasons why people move, what they hope for.
What really stuck with me today is, history isn't just something we read about in books. It's still with us. We see it in our laws, in our policies, even just in the way we think without realizing it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It shows how important it is to really get history, not just the dates and names, but how it's still affecting us now.
We started this whole deep dive asking how something like Operation Wetback could happen. And we talked about all the political stuff, the economic fears, the prejudice. But maybe the most important thing we've learned is we got to watch out for those things that try to pull us apart.
The things that make us scared and make us see other people as the enemy.
Because if we don't, we'll just end up making the same mistakes again and again, hurting people, being unfair, tearing our own country apart.
Exactly. So, learning from the past, that's the only way we can hope to build a better future, one that's fair and just.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up. This deep dive into Operation Wetback, it's been really eye-opening, honestly, kind of disturbing. But we can't just ignore these dark parts of our history. We got to learn from them.
Absolutely. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I hope everyone listening will keep thinking about these issues, challenge what they think they know and talk to each other about immigration and how complex it really is.